Great. Thanks so much, Julie. Rabbi Buchdahl is my grandfather, but he'll appreciate the welcome too. Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here for the first time. My name is Max. I live in Washington Heights. For today, I'm joining from suburban Philadelphia, and I'm really excited to be here and to learn and to learn Torah from you and with you. As Julie said, we're sort of in the middle of Moshe's speech as the people get ready to enter the land of Israel. And today, Parshiot like this, the weekly portion like this, isn't always necessarily arranged thematically, but this week there are actually a lot of similar themes that come up throughout the portion. A lot of them having to do with the running of society, with government. Obviously, the Parsha's name itself, Shoftim, means judges. The first two words, Shoftim v'shotrim, judges and officials, you shall appoint. That's the beginning of our Parsha, and there's a lot about in this Parsha about jurisprudence, about how legal society is supposed to be run, the Torah's vision for that. Obviously, the famous verse, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue, comes up very early in the Parsha. And there's a lot of other laws about how society is supposed to run. Today, we're going to focus on two specific verses in the 17th chapter. I'm going to share my screen in just a moment. And essentially, we're going to be asking a few questions today. We're going to look at two verses about the appointment of a king, the Torah's version of appointing a king. Hopefully, some of you have seen the source sheet a little bit. We'll make our way through and get through as much as we can. But basically, we're going to try and ask a few different questions. We're definitely going to ask. We're going to try and answer or sort of interrogate a few different questions. The first question, and essentially the most basic, is there a commandment to appoint a king in Jewish law, or is it something that is simply a choice that we can make should we choose? And the Torah, we're going to try and read the verses. I think the verses themselves could potentially make a case for either, but we're going to sort of work through later Jewish history. We're going to look at a passage from the Book of Samuel, one of the most prominent judges, one of the most prominent Shoftim in Jewish history. We're also going to take a peek in the Talmud and see what the rabbis of the Talmud have to say about two different opinions, essentially, about this question of setting up a king and its consequences. So it's that question of commandment, and the other thing that I want to sort of have in the back of our minds is the interaction, the potential conflict between having that human king, should we decide, or if we're commanded to set up a human king, the interaction between our allegiance, loyalty to that human king, and our allegiance and loyalty to the King of Kings, to Malchei HaMelachim, to God. And what I want to think about is there a problem? Is the Torah worried? Is God worried? Is Samuel worried? Are we worried about potentially, essentially mixing up our kings should we decide to appoint a flesh and blood, a human king? Just in terms of, I want this to be fairly interactive, so I'll be asking questions throughout, and we'll try and get some thoughts going. And also, if you don't want to unmute, if you're having trouble with your camera, your microphone, or anything like that, you can also feel free to put comments in the chat, and I'll do my best to look through those. Okay, great. All right, I think we're gonna get started. Let me share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that? All right, good, amazing. Is it zoomed in enough? Can everyone?
That looks great.
That looks great, perfect. Okay, so as I said, we're looking initially here just at two short verses. And this obviously sets the scene, sets the stage for what's going to come later in Jewish history and thought when it comes to the question of a king. So I'll just read it quickly. First, first I want to, this first phrase, ki tavo el haaretz, if after you have entered the land. This sort of part of our question is going to rely on how we translate this word ki. There are 4 different ways we can translate that word, and how we do is going to make a big difference. The translation that's here is if, right? If after you've entered the land, I'll read it in full and we'll come back to it. If after you have entered the land that your God Hashem has assigned to you and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by God Hashem, by your God Hashem. Be sure to set as king over yourself one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kin. Okay, so these first 2 words, ki to, really just the first word, ki, can either mean if, as in if you decide to do this, which would mean that it's voluntary. It could also potentially mean when, which could be setting up a commandment, potentially even an expectation. But first, I unfortunately can't see everyone on the screen, so I'm going to do my best. If I asked you just after reading these 2 very short verses, do you have an instinct about commandment or voluntary? What screams out to you in these two first verses? I'm going to try and expand the camera as much as I can to see people, but you can either raise your real hand or your virtual hand. Here, I see David E.
Okay, unmute. I think I thought it was more of a command.
Okay, what makes you say that?
That, we're progressing into the land that God has chosen for us, and my sense is that God is not going to be there to manage every detail of our lives. So he's setting up the foundation and he's setting up the structure, and he's taught us all of these lessons. He said, okay, it's time for you to take the ball and run with it.
Interesting. So a sort of progression from, God's presence as the Amud Ha'anan, the cloud in the desert, but once we move into the land, it sort of sets up a new stage. Interesting. I'm just going to go in order of what I see. First, I just see iPhone.
The host is not allowing participants to unmute themselves.
We can hear you, iPhone. Go ahead.
Okay. I see this as a conditional statement. There's 2 parts of it. First is upon going into the land, and if you then choose. So I see as this giving an option to us rather than a commandment, with sort of the sense that God expects we're going to do this anyhow, but he gives us that choice.
Okay, so it could be trying to play both sides a little bit. Great, Cheryl.
So it looks to me, it's if you should happen to decide, you should be free to do it. So it's totally up to you if you want to do it. But if you decide that you want to do it, be sure that it's someone from your own community. So it's totally up to you if you want to, but if you're going to do it, these are the rules.
Great, and I'll just add, there's much larger context here, and I would encourage you to, if you have a Tanakh, if you have a Torah next to you, to look at the next few verses. There are several conditions for what this king needs to do. They need to essentially write their own Torah, have it next to them all the time. They can't have too many kings, too many wives. So this verse starts to get at those restrictions, but you're picking up on something that I think is true, that even if God is choosing the king, there are a ton of conditions that for sure limit what what the power is going to be. Yep, Devorah.
It's permissible because when they had demanded a king for King Saul, God did not want him to have a king. He was very disappointed that they did. So he allowed it. So it is something that's permissible, but it's not something that God commands.
Great. We're gonna. It's a good transition. We'll get there in a minute. We're gonna look closely at those verses in Samuel. Yeah, Howard.
Yeah, hi. So I think that you're right, Rabbi, in focusing on the word key, because it does give that discretion, either discretionary or maybe mandatory. I happen to think it's discretionary, as I think most of the people on the call have said, because when the Torah wants us to do something, they say it in very explicit terms. You shall not, you shall, or you shall not. Very clear. There's no ambiguity. There's just too much ambiguity here to think that this is a commandment. Thank you.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Esther Westelman, I see your real hand. You're still muted.
It's definitely an option, not in my opinion, and not a law, but a very limited option. It's not a king with complete power. Like it talks about horses, and makes me think of horsepower in a car. It's limited. It doesn't matter how fast your car can go. The government puts a limit to how fast you can go. But I see it as not as a law because Shmuel is against it.
Yeah, we'll look at that in just a minute. Just these last two comments, Diane and then Linda, and then we're gonna keep going.
Yeah, I agree with the others, what the others have said regarding it being conditional, particularly what you've bolded, as do all the nations about me, which is exactly what we felt. We have the benefit of knowing what happened from Kings and Samuel, that initially there were judges, and then the people started to demand that they needed a unified leader. So, and the verses say, if you decide that this is what you want, then this is how it should be. So that part of it as to how the king should conduct himself is set forth, whereas the choice to have a king is up to the people.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Linda, last comment, and then there's gonna be more opportunities to share.
It's just, I think it's a choice, but what concerns me in this passage, and you've highlighted it here, as do all the other nations about me, it seems that we've always been told not to do what the nations about us are doing. So that doesn't fit in to me at all. And I wonder if you're going to go there. I'm not sure, but it's glaring to me.
Yeah, I for sure. Thank you for bringing that up. That was my next piece, and I agree. And as I was looking at this and thinking about it, I think this verse, or these two verses, would make perfect sense without that phrase, Kechol Hagoyim, as do all the nations about me. Right? It could very easily say, if you decide, take possession, decide, I'll set a king about me, you shall be free to do so. That would be perfectly fine way of saying it. And what I want to just sort of plant before we move on to look at the verses from Samuel, whereas as we've heard already bits and pieces from a few people, there's going to be a very specific attitude towards kingship that we're going to see there. I think the inclusion just of this brief phrase, as do all the nations about me, I think, Linda, you're very right that there are plenty of places in the Torah where the Jewish people is told that we're going to be different. Am skula, right? A unique nation. And to say, this is also a future quote that is being planted. Moshe is quoting the future Israelites by saying, essentially, they're going to say that they want to be like other nations. And if that is potentially something that is looked down upon, not favored according to the Torah, then for sure, I think this could be a little hint within this text saying, Yeah, you're free to do so, but just be careful about where you're going. All right, so with that note, we're going to move to the book of Samuel, into the 8th chapter. I'll take more hands in a few seconds. I want to look at this. Just a little bit of context. Samuel is a judge living in the land of Israel. We're now, scholars are a little bit unsure, but a couple hundred years or so after the Book of Deuteronomy, and we're going to see what happens with Samuel when this request that Deuteronomy told us was coming comes. Before I do that, I'm just going to look at a brief. Take a look in the chat. Okay, you decide, so voluntary, strongly encouraged, choice. Okay, so there seems to be a lot of support in the chat for choice. We'll see where that goes. Okay, great. Could I have a volunteer to read in the English this passage from Samuel? If you could raise your okay, Danielle, I think is that a hand for a reading?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and his second son's name was Abiah. They sat as judges in Beersheba, but his sons did not follow in his ways. They were bent on gain. They accepted bribes, and they subverted justice. All the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "You have grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways. Therefore appoint a king for us, to govern us all like other nations." Samuel was displeased that they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord replied to Samuel, "Heed the demand of the people in everything they say to you, for it is not you that they have rejected. It is me they have rejected as their king. Like everything else they have done ever since I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshipping other gods. So they are doing to you. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly, and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them."
Great, thank you, Danielle. And David, don't worry, I didn't forget your command position there. Okay, so this is the text in Samuel. It's not. If we have time for it, we're gonna look at the continuation. But I'll just get to the right point. I'll just briefly note before I open up for some thoughts that the language here in Samuel is basically identical to the language that we saw in Deuteronomy, right? To govern us like all other nations. Okay, same exact phrasing. Deuteronomy got it right. Okay, and then what we see is that Samuel gets upset. So my question, I guess, first two things, two questions. First is, we saw the two verses in Deuteronomy. Now we've seen this passage from later piece of literature. With both of these passages here, now how do you feel about the question of commandment or voluntary? And I'm curious if there's anyone, David or others, who felt after the first text that it was a commandment, if you still think so, and why. And then also, I think, and the commentators get into this, why is Samuel upset? If the people use the exact same language that permitted them a king only a few books ago, why is Samuel upset? So there are already a few hands, so I'll start with Suzanne Bernstein. You're still muted, Suzanne. Suzanne, you're still muted.
Okay. I'm using the Stone Tanakh, Samuel 1, and it has the birth of Samuel. And there was a certain man, son of Toz, son of Zuth. He had two wives. One was named Hannah, and the second was Peninnah. Peninnah had children. Hannah had no children. And then it goes on. Is that where you are?
No, so we're in chapter 8.
You're chapter 8 of Samuel, chapter 8.
And first Samuel, chapter 8. Yeah, sure. Diana.
So the thing that strikes me on this reading is that don't kings normally appoint themselves by dominating in battle? This seems to be a rather egalitarian way of getting a king. It's almost like, president.
Yeah, and what's interesting, we hopefully will get there, but if we don't, I'll just flag it that later on, essentially what happens is Samuel gives them a long warning about what it means to have a king, and then the people respond and they add something to their response. I'll scroll down to it just in case we don't get there. Here in verses 19 and 20, more verse 20, right? The people get a warning from Samuel saying, be careful with this king thing you're asking about. Then the people say, actually, we want it. And the first thing they say is, essentially, we want a king because we need a warrior. We need someone to lead us in battle. So I think you're picking up on something that is for sure usually the case. And I think my question, my first thought is, the people may want a king based on military prowess, but is that what God wants? And we didn't look at the full context in Deuteronomy, but I would argue, given what's there about essentially asking for a scholar king, for a king who's going to have the Torah next to him all of the time, that I don't know if that's God's. Even if we argue that God is commanding, I don't know if what the people are asking for is necessarily what God has in mind. Noreen.
To your question, we could look at it cynically and say that Samuel wanted to be the ruler and wanted to be in charge, and that it was disappointing for him that here he'd done all this work in his life and they didn't want him to be the leader of some sort. But on the other hand, you could say, well, he believed in God and that God was the king, and that the people, didn't need a king because they had a king. So those are two ways of looking at it.
Yeah, that first way is for sure, I think for sure there. And there for sure could be some selfish, Samuel wanting to protect his position of power. Definitely. Suzanne. Suzanne, you're muted.
Would you please tell us again where you are?
Yeah, it's 1 Samuel chapter 8. And right now we're looking at starting with verse 1 until verse 9. It's also on this, I don't know if you can see the screen share, but it's here as well. Okay. Diane and then Esther.
I disagree that Samuel was angry because he wanted power. Samuel knew from the time he was born that he was there to serve God. So I agree with the interpretation that he was angry that the people were rejecting God. And he was angry that the people were rejecting his leadership as God's representative, but not that he wanted to be, in the role of a king or a power, but that he was following God's commandments, if you will, and the people were rejecting that.
Right.
And God was reminding him that, don't take it personally. You're my representative. I'm the one that they're rejecting. That's how I interpret it.
Yeah, and I think that you make a great case. And I think that God's language of comparing it to all of what's happened since Egypt, bringing up for us all of the times that it seems like the people have gone against God in the, in the last few hundred years, I think that's a pretty intense statement. That's a pretty intense thing to say when you're responding to the question of a king. I just quickly look at Emily's comment at the chat. I'm actually more confused that people seem to have a legitimate complaint, but asking for a king is the wrong solution. You're saying that the legitimate complaint there is because of Samuel's sons being worse than him. Is that?
Yes, that's what I meant.
That's what you meant. Okay. Yeah, I think that's I think it's totally fair. I think that's I originally didn't bring the first few verses, and I was going to start us with the request, but I didn't because I think you can't have the context of asking for the king without what the people see coming down the line. So I think you're right that it could be that the people have really honestly, faithfully held off on a king for all these years, but now when they see what's going to happen when Samuel's getting older, Samuel's about to die, I think that it could be that this type of complaint, the context of it is just different than what Deuteronomy was talking about. I think it's a fair read. Great. Cheryl. Samuel may feel he has failed with his sons rejecting his wisdom. He's getting old and has a few alternatives. Yeah. I wanted to go to Esther. Sorry, I didn't go straight to you. Esther, you're muted.
I don't think Samuel took it personally because to him it was a question of God is your king. And because he couldn't take it personally because what they said is your children are not following you. So therefore there is no continuity, and that is our second option. So it definitely wasn't against Samuel himself, but Samuel's negative reaction is because God is our king.
Yeah. I'll just, before we move on, Linda brought up earlier the question of the phrase Kechol HaGoyim, like all the other nations around us, which is in the text in Deuteronomy as part of the request for a king and repeated here verbatim by the people. And when Rashi, the famous commentator Rashi, looks at this verse, the reason that he thinks Samuel is upset, that Samuel gets displeased, is because they include that phrase. So I think Linda, you're in good company in thinking that there is a difference between just wanting a king and wanting a king especially for the reason of imitating the nations around you. So I think that's there. There are a few other reasons that the commentators give for why Samuel is upset. The Malbim says that it's because it's said as a complaint that they're not coming sort of honestly and saying, yeah, we just want a king, that it's particularly there's something about the complaint that's bothering Samuel. And then on the sort of opposite end, which I think is really interesting, there's a commentator named Yosef Kara, who shouldn't be confused with Yosef Karo, who's the writer of the Shulchan Aruch. Yosef Kara is a commentator who was lived in the same time as Rashi. And he says that Samuel is upset for the other reason, for the opposite reason, essentially that Samuel is upset they didn't ask for a king earlier, which I don't necessarily see here in the text, but I think it was interesting to bring it. Linda.
From reading it, it seems like it continues God's frustration with the Israelis as Samuel is frustrated. But then I'm not sure if I'm reading it right, correct me, but God is saying, that's okay, let them have a king, but warn them about the problems, like sort of be careful what you wish for. Is that correct?
Yeah, so let me just quickly scroll to what's next, because I don't think we're going to get to all of this in time. So Samuel comes and says, so Samuel gives the warning, right? I'll just sort of skim through it and you'll get the idea of what's happening, right? What's the king going to do? He's going to take your sons and he's going to enlist them in the army. He's going to, he's going to put them in his court. He's going to make them, plow his fields. He's going to take your daughters to work for him. He's going to seize all your fields. He's going to take your grain. He's going to take your slaves. He's going to take your flock. This is the warning that Samuel gives. So yeah, I think Linda, you're you're on the right track. That these are very strong words about what the king is going to do. So this is just a sense of the warning that comes. And then Samuel says, there's going to be a time, eventually after all this happens, you're going to regret. And the people say, no, we want a military leader. Yeah. iPad, I see with a virtual hand.
Yes, thank you. I just find it interesting. We don't hear that Samuel's upset because his sons turn out not to be quite appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly not following in his footsteps and doing what's right.
Yeah, that's. I think it's an important thread here, that the context of his sons being disappointing. Yeah, Dobby, and then we're gonna move on.
I just want, I know that there is a continuation after the, Deuteronomy. We have the entire book of Judges, which is really an epic fail, or what not, how the people should not, behave. And, the book of Judges stresses, because there wasn't a king over, to rule over the Israelites. So, I feel that there is the people have constantly, they failed, and the king, the ruler, that is the ideal ruler, is of course the spiritual one that's put forth in Deuteronomy. But if you think about, what these people were facing, they needed somebody to protect them and rule them. Just the fact that it comes directly after the book of Judges, that we start with Samuel.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just gonna briefly go through what's in the chat in the last few minutes. Uriel says, always saw it as the beginning of rejection of Hashem's rule. I think that's a big theme here. Zadie, too difficult to read this literally, too many theys. Sorry, which they, let me go scroll back. Like here, so they are doing to you? Is that what you meant?
It was further up, I think. Yeah, there it is. Yes,
there?
yes.
Yeah, I think that's referring to the Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to the Israelites. Okay, James. I agree. First sons of Eli, then Eli's rejected. Samuel. Next Samuel. Samuel, to me, I may be wrong, but then the current corrupt system of worship is found in the priesthood. As essentially like a nepotism question being part of the problem. Could be. Miriam, it seems to me the Israelites would prefer not to have a king, since the abuses shown by the sons of Samuel are a hint of what's to come in a hereditary system. Yep, definitely. Mike, it shows how difficult it is to set up government, for sure. And that creates a longing for a messianic figure. Yeah, and there is plenty of concern about holding up messianic figures in Jewish history. So I think it's a good concern. Okay, we only have a few minutes left. I want to go to this piece in Masechet Sanhedrin in the Talmud. So just before I do that, just to sort of recap where we're at so far. In Deuteronomy, we had a difference of opinion. There seemed to be a lot of people here who saw that text as allowing a king, but not necessarily commanding it. David and others saw it as a command. Then we had this text in Samuel where the people ask for a king, essentially using the same language that was in Deuteronomy. Samuel gets upset. God essentially also gets upset. Samuel warns the people about what's to come with the king. They want a king anyway. But from what we've seen, obviously what we've seen is not the entirety of the Tanakh on kings. Obviously there is an entire Book of Kings that was so big it got split into two, which comes later. And there is a lot of positive attitude about kingship potentially in those books. David and Solomon generally held up as pretty positive figures by later rabbinic literature, although they each had plenty of faults. There are later kings. Josiah is well liked, and I'm admitting that I did, based on what we saw in our parsha, I have sort of cherry picked the not great parts about kings. But if I could have someone read, this is from a statement in the Talmud in Masechet Sanhedrin, and they're talking about our verse about essentially the question that I asked at the beginning: is it a commandment to set up a king? Is it voluntary? Could I have a volunteer to read a pretty short statement of Rabbi Yehuda? Yeah, David. David E.
And so would Rabbi Yehuda say, 3 mitzvot were commanded to the Jewish people upon their entrance into Eretz Yisrael. They were commanded to establish a king for themselves and to cut off the seed of Amalek and to build the chosen house, i.e. the temple in Jerusalem.
Okay, pretty clear statement for Rabbi Yehuda. It's a commandment to set up, to establish a king, right? He connects it, and this is interesting. I can't remember who said it earlier about the comment about war, right? But it essentially immediately connects the commandment to establish a king with going to war against Amalek. And then there's a big infrastructure project that comes immediately afterwards in building the temple. So, and essentially what Talmud later says is that these 3 are in order. That essentially first you establish a king, then the king goes and sets up and cuts off Amalek, and then the king builds the temple. So these 3 aren't independent of one another. They're very much connected. I'm just gonna look in the chat. On what did he base that? On what did he base the idea that it's a commandment, Diane? Is that what you're? Is that what you're asking?
Sorry, which Diane?
Diane King, sorry.
Yeah, I couldn't get unmuted. We just read the text that said, if you choose to have a king, then do this. So where did this Rabbi Yehuda say it was commanded?
I think
what did he, what's his proof text?
So his proof text is our verse. And I think how he's reading, I'll scroll back up to it. We're back now to Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 and 15. What he, I think, is reading, I mentioned at the very beginning, focusing on the, on the word key. And I think he's reading key as when you've entered the land, go for it. I think he's reading it specifically as saying, essentially, that it's not optional. I think he's reading this verse as it's not just you shall be free to, this is something you should do. I think also, and I tried to hint at this a second ago, I think also, Rabbi Yehuda has a lot of later history that we haven't seen in terms of kingship that probably gives him a positive idea of kingship. He may think very highly of David and Solomon. So I think this is the proof text, and that may be part of the sort of the underlying.
Are the words in Hebrew for decide, and I'm reading the English translation, of course. Yeah. You decide, and you shall be free. Does the Hebrew have different connotations than those words have in English?
I mean, not really. The Hebrew here, som tasim alecha, is an intensive verb form. And so the translation here is you shall be free. I think there's, and this is the fun of translation, is there is a way to read, because som tasim is an intensive verb form, it's in what it takes whatever is being said and it says potentially you should do this. There are other places where he could be reading that in from. So he could, he could want to translate that differently, I think, is another question. And that's unfortunately what we've got.
Well, I respectfully disagree with Rabbi Yehuda.
So I don't think we're going to have time to get to, let's go quickly, and then I'll take a comment to there's a position for you, Diane, don't worry. This is the position of Rabbi Nehorai, also in Sanhedrin. I'll just, for time's sake, quickly read it. Right, so this is a continuation of what we saw before. Rabbi Nehorai says this biblical passage, meaning the passage we saw in Deuteronomy, was stated only in response to the Jewish people's complaint, right? And then he quotes our verse, right? Indicating that essentially it's only a commandment once it's been asked for, right? So Rabbi Nehorai's position is basically once the Jewish people ask for a king, then it's a commandment, but it's not a commandment until they ask for it. That's when the commandment kicks in, right? So that's his position. And so he's reading the verse in the opposite way of Rabbi Yehuda. He's saying it's optional. So didn't want to make you think that your position wasn't represented here by the rabbis. I'll just take David one last comment and then begin to wrap up.
Forgive me, I entered a little bit late. You may have covered this, but my take on this whole thing about appointing a king deals with people want a leader that they can see, feel, and hear. And that's the issue that is facing the people. So the king is not necessarily the spiritual leader. He is the government. And he will, just to the side, he is instructed to write the Torah and to know what the Torah includes, but he will be sort of the administrator as opposed to the Kohanim or any other spiritual leaders. That's my take. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just go over what's been in the chat and then we'll wrap up. So Wendy, is it clear that the Melech or king here is a human king? I think it is. I think they are talking about a human king. Jen, perhaps God was hoping the king they would choose was him. It's interesting, very interesting. What would the alternatives have been? I mean, so they were living in an alternative. They've been living in an era of judges, of limited self-governance, but with, I think the interesting other alternative is religious leadership, right? That I think that what we just talked about, what David just mentioned in terms of the king writing a Torah and having a Torah by his side all the time, I think is essentially saying that what God's image of a king is not a military warrior. God's image of a king is someone who's going to study God's Torah, which could be a reflection of the comment we saw before. Unfortunately, I see there are some hands, but unfortunately we're out of time. It's been really great. As we said in the beginning, this is my first time. Really enjoyed being here. I hope that these texts were juicy and that you continue to think about and chew on them throughout the day. And just one final thought: we're heading, it's Elul, Rosh Hashanah is a few weeks away. There's a lot of language that we're going to see in a few weeks about kingship. Right, one of the phrases we're going to say a lot is Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. And so I hope that through this text study, looking at some of what the Torah and our rabbis have to say about kingship, that we'll have a more intense relationship and thoughts about what it means to have a king and who that king is. So thank you everyone very much. It's been a lot of fun. Shabbat Shalom.